Hey everyone, and welcome to the Outlier Podcast. I'm Lauren Conlin, and this is part 9 into my investigation and coverage of the ritualistic abuse scandal, mainly out of Utah. And lately, between the Ruby Franke docuseries and the Dateline interview with Lori Vallow Daybell, I'm beginning to think that all of this stuff really is truly connected. And I'm just going to say it feels a lot like mind control in certain situations. And I don't mean to sound conspiratorial. I don't get me wrong. Adults are responsible for their actions and for whatever decision they make. And yes, did Jodi Hildebrandt influence Ruby Franke? Yes. But Franke is still a demonic piece of crap, in my opinion, as is her husband. And sure, did Chad Daybell influence Lori? Yes, but she didn't have to go through with it all. But anyway, today I want to discuss the topic of dissociation and memory suppression, false memories, and all of the controversy that comes along with it pertaining to SRA and experts and what have you. Now, much of the SRA allegations have been refuted by saying that, oh, the survivors were hypnotized. And I mean, they've even accused David Lee Hamblin of hypnotizing some of his patients to say some of this stuff, which is crazy. But they've also said, oh, these memories are falsely planted. And, you know, the truth is here, what I'm learning, every case is different. And every case is nuanced. So the answers to these questions, does false memory syndrome exist? Does repressed memory syndrome exist? Can they coexist? The answer is yes. Nobody knows the answers conclusively. All they know is that both things can be true at once and both things are possible. So I do believe that those who have bravely come forward and shared their stories, and even if they didn't remember this stuff into adulthood, I believe them. And Jason and Alexia of We Are the People, they had this amazing woman on their show, Mary Beth, and her story just broke my heart. And I'll actually put a link to that episode here. And what's so also interesting is that I was doing my own research and this clip, it seemed to be making the rounds. And it's just funny because I know a lot of people saw this. It's not just me because I've been Googling things about SRA and whatnot, and it's an awful topic. And that's why I can't believe it's gone viral. But I just thought it was crazy that it's so relevant right now. And I want to play it for you. It's a woman named Kivi Linga who grew up in a cult that practiced SRA, and it's wild. It sounds a lot like what was written in the 2012 Hamblin sisters victim impact statement. So let me pull this up and play it very quickly for you.
He was 8 years old from Chicago, or at least that's what my parents told me. Most traumatic night of my life. Like, my mom and dad were like, he's your new brother. We had dinner with him. They called it the Last Supper, and afterwards they sacrificed him. So it was my turn when I was 5, almost 6, to solely sacrifice a child, and it was Sam, the 8-year-old. We just had dinner with him. I love Sam. I'll never stop loving Sam, and I'll never betray Sam. I think that he's a big reason why I'm here today recovering, because it was such a traumatic memory that I've held on. But during that ritual, we had dinner with Sam, and I thought he was my new brother, and I was so excited because I'm like, this brother, this 8-year-old's going to save my broken family. And after the ritual, things changed pretty quick. Roles in my family changed throughout the years. For example, my older sister started to graduate towards the cleanup role, which was my father's role. So during the exact ritual itself, my older sister wasn't there. I remember me on the right, my younger sister on the left. My mom was behind me, and she gave me a knife for my right hand, and she told me to do it to Sam. I wouldn't. I couldn't. And I thought either something really bad would happen to me or Sam would get let go. So there was a lot of communication in this ritual. My mom was saying, you have to do it, you have to do it. And like I said, she always had this sense of urgency. She was just getting so mad at me. And I thought she would take my hand and make me do it myself. And that's not what happened. She gave it to somebody else who looked very disassociated and did it themselves.
Did your mom force you to eat Sam?
Yes. That was my consequence for not sacrificing Sam. And it wasn't the first time I was fed human flesh. Thankfully, my mother cooked it. I've heard of other stories where they don't. But because it was Sam, someone who I grew an attachment to, I feel like that was me drinking the Kool-Aid or taking sips. Like, that's kind of what enabled me, or a big factor, to go into denial, because I felt so guilty. And I will say, I didn't eat any of them fully. Like, I had this thing where I would chew it up, and then when my mom wasn't looking, I would put it under a blanket or in a milk glass. She never said anything to me about it, thank God. But I feel like I did that to help alleviate some of the guilt.
Sure.
And I think it might have worked, too.
Wow. Let me pull this off. I mean, I have chills. And again, that sounds a lot like what many of us read in the 2012 Hamblin sister victim impact statement. And I know that was a lot. And most people, when they come across this clip, and you can't blame them, they're going to move on quickly and say, oh, that's crap. That can't be true. This is insane. This is ridiculous. And yeah, I can't blame them. But take a deep dive for those of you who think it's not true. I'm telling you, I was somewhat in your position. But yeah, before I get into some clips, or the clip of my interview with forensic psychologist Dr. Craig Wetterer, who also happens to be a lawyer. He's great. I know, I feel so lazy. I want to read a section from Glenn Pace's memo, and I think it's important that I refresh everybody's memory here as we are about to dive into some of these topics. And she actually mentioned, that woman, Kibby, mentioned dissociation, which I think is a huge buzzword here. But yeah, first let me read from the PACE memo to refresh your memory. And then I'm going to get into a little bit of some generalities with false memory syndrome, which is totally different. But reading from the PACE memo directly here, just to refresh your memory. And this was July 19th, 1990. Pursuant to the committee's request, I am writing this memorandum to pass along what I have learned about ritualistic child abuse. Hopefully, it will be of some value to you as you continue to monitor the problem. I have met with 60 victims. That number could be twice or 3 times as many if I did not discipline myself to only 1 meeting per week. I have not wanted my involvement with this issue to become a handicap in fulfilling my assigned responsibilities. On the other hand, I felt someone needed to pay the price to obtain an intellectual and spiritual conviction as to the seriousness of this problem within the church. One of the 60 victims with who I have met, 53 are female and 7 are male. 8 are children, and the abuse occurred in the following places: Utah, 37, Idaho, 3, California, 4, Mexico, 2, and other places, 14. 53 victims are currently living in the state of Utah. All 60 individuals are members of the church, and 45 victims allege witnessing and or participating in human sacrifice. The majority were abused by relatives, often their parents, and all have developed psychological problems, and most have been diagnosed as having multiple personality disorders or some other form of dissociative disorder. Ritualistic abuse is the most hideous of all child abuse. The basic objective is premeditated: to systematically and methodically torture and terrorize children until they are forced to dissociate. The torture is not a consequence of the loss of temper, but the execution of well-planned, well-thought-out rituals often performed by close relatives. The only escape for the children is to dissociate. They will develop a new personality to enable them to endure various forms of abuse. And when the episode is over, the core personality is again in control and the individual is not conscious of what happened. Dissociation also serves the purposes of the cult because the children have no day-to-day memory of these atrocities. They go through adolescence, early adulthood with no active memory of what is actually taking place. Oftentimes, they continue in these rituals through their teens, early 20s, unaware of their involvement. Many individuals with whom I've spoken with serve missions, and it is not been until later that they begin to remember these missions. One individual has memories of participating in rituals while serving as a full-time missionary. The victims lead relatively normal lives, but the memories are locked up in a compartment in their minds and surface in various ways. They don't know how to cope with these emotions because they can't find the source. As they become adults and move into another environment, something triggers the memories, and consequently, flashbacks or nightmares occur. One day, they'll be having a normal life, and the next day, they'll be in a mental hospital in a fetal position. The memories of early childhood are recalled in so much detail that they once again actually feel this pain that caused the dissociation in the first place. There are two reasons why adults can remember with such detail events that happened in their past. First, the terror they experienced was so stark that it was placed in their mind. Second, the memory was compartmentalized in a certain portion of the mind and was not subjected to the delusion of experiences of ensuing years. And that's dilution, not delusion, excuse me. And then it is fresh as if it happened yesterday. These memories seem to come in layers. For example, the first memory might be of incest. Then they remember robes or candles. Next, they realize that their father or their mother were both present when they were being abused. Another layer will be the memory of seeing other people hurt or even killed. Then they remember seeing babies killed. Another layer is realizing that they themselves have participated in these sacrifices. And one of the most painful memories may be that they even sacrificed their own baby. With each layer of memory comes another set of problems with which they must deal. Some have said that the witnesses to this type of treatment cannot be trusted because of the victim's unstable condition and because practically all of them have some kind of dissociative disorder. In fact, that the stories are so bizarre as to raise serious credibility questions. But the irony is that one of the objectives of the cult is to create multiple personalities within the children in order to keep these secrets. They live in society without society having any idea that something is wrong, since the children and the teenagers don't even realize there is another life occurring in the darkness and in the secret. However, when 60 witnesses testify to the same type of torture and murder, it becomes impossible for me personally not to believe them. I mentioned multiple personalities because of the spiritual healing, which must take place in the lives of these victims, and it cannot happen without their priesthood leaders understanding something about it. I'm going to stop right there because that's a lot, but I wanted to refresh everybody's memory about that. And I agree, it's tough when double digits come forward and all say the same thing. But I also want to bring you the opposite, the rebuttal. something called false memory syndrome. And I'm not going to get really, really deep into it, but I will give you a little bit of a rundown here. False memory syndrome refers to a controversial concept proposed by the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which is FMSF, and that describes a pattern of behavior, where individuals develop strong beliefs about traumatic experiences that never actually happened, often arising from therapy practices aimed at recovering repressed memories. The term was popularized by Pamela and Peter Freyd, who created the FMSF after their daughter had accused her father, Peter, of SA, which they believed was a false memory created through therapy. And their adult daughter, Jennifer, accused her father when she was an adult. So, what's interesting here is that the criticism of false memory syndrome and what's been said about Peter Freyd and his wife, why they created it, is because of the fact that their daughter accused her father of abuse. So, I mean, it's been argued that they were trying to undermine her credibility. So I did want to just point that out, that both sides exist here. And you're going to hear a lot more from Dr. Craig Wetterer, who specializes in comprehensive forensic neuropsychological disorders and general psychological assessments. So without further ado, I'm going to take myself off the screen and pull up my interview with Dr. Craig, which I think you will all find so fascinating. Dr. Wetterer, thank you so much for joining me. This is a tough topic. It's a very, very tough topic. Trauma, abuse, repressed memories, false memories, dissociation, and it seems to be an argument in I guess the world of psychology, but do you mind just telling me about your background and your experience?
Sure, and thank you for having me, Lauren. So my background actually starts early on in my career. So I started working in law enforcement. I was a police officer for many years. I experienced a lot of trauma myself in terms of exposure to things that happened on the job. And then when I shifted into clinical psychology about 15 years ago, I started my training in clinical psychology and ended up getting a PhD in clinical psychology. The focus of my clinical training was primarily in trauma-informed care. So I did a lot of work with first responders, and a lot of those folks had diagnoses of post-traumatic stress disorder and the like. So I started to develop an expertise in this area and an interest in this area as well. So a lot of my work, my clinical work, has been working with people who have experienced trauma, and some have developed PTSD, some have not. So that's my primary clinical work. And then, of course, I've also done quite a bit of assessment work as well. So I'm also a forensic psychologist by training. So I'm assessing people all the time in legal settings, people who are justice involved. A lot of those folks have had trauma histories, quite a bit of trauma history. We see people who are incarcerated do have histories of significant trauma as well. So it's pretty pervasive in the population.
When it comes down to it, and part of what I guess the argument is when it comes to survivors going to authorities and saying, I just remembered that this happened to me. I blocked it out. I was so traumatized by it that I repressed this memory. Something triggered it, and here we are. And that seems to be a great defense, I guess, for the accused, right? That seems to be a great defense. Oh, you just remembered it.
Yeah, so this is an area it's quite controversial still, even to this day. And you speak to the issue of this repression of memory that can happen. So what I'll tell you from the side of the clinical psychology and the neuroscience space is that there's still a lot of debate about this in terms of whether, how valid is this issue of memory repression. And one of the reasons why it's controversial still is that, we like to be able to map things in the brain and understand, like, well, how would this happen mechanistically in the brain when, in terms of this what we call dissociative amnesia. And that's really what this is when an individual experiences severe trauma. There's a number of, documented clinical cases and a number of clinicians who do believe that repression can happen. Memory repression can occur in severe trauma. I'm one of those clinicians that believes this is definitely possible. The exact mechanisms in terms of how it happens in the brain, it's not completely understood, but we do know that there are alterations in brain circuits when people are exposed to severe trauma. And that has to do with the frontal lobe of the brain. That's the front part of the brain where we have all of our executive functioning, our decision making, and all of our attention to tasks and things like that. The limbic system, which is sort of our fear center in the brain, and then the hippocampus, which is sort of a memory consolidation circuit that helps consolidate memories. And when people experience severe trauma, what we think happens is we think there's this disconnection in these circuits in terms of cohesive memory consolidation. And then in some instances, this dissociation, this disconnection in these circuits can theoretically lead to what we would classically see as dissociative amnesia. In other words, this inability to recall specific sequences or elements of a trauma. And this is, like I said, there are some neuroscientists who agree with this, and they're doing the research right now to try to really fully understand how this is mapped in the brain in terms of what's going on. But I think there is some evidence to support the presence of this type of condition.
Right. And it's tough because, you serve as an expert witness in trials. And so for you, to say all this, and look, I'm assuming you would get up on the stand and you would say that, but I believe a defense attorney would also rip that apart.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. I've been on the stand in cases in which I've testified to the dissociative components to post-traumatic stress disorder. Because in post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly in the more severe forms of it, we can see dissociation. And dissociation, just in layman's terms, is essentially a disconnection from the self or from the environment. So there's two different primary types of dissociation that can happen. There's one we call derealization, and then there's depersonalization. And derealization, somebody is disconnected from their circumstances. They describe a situation in which they feel like they're disconnected from their environment. Whereas in depersonalization, this is where the person is disconnected from the self in some way. They describe this sense that they're not inside their body. And so I've been on the stand, in murder trials, in which, the death penalty is on the table here, for this defendant, right? And the issue is, if this defendant does in fact have post-traumatic stress disorder, could dissociation explain the behavior and the conduct of defendant, right? In terms of what happened. In other words, the defendant claims that he could not recall, the sequence of these events because of dissociation. So what I can tell you is that, like, in my experience, juries oftentimes do not agree with this. In other words, they're not necessarily going to buy it. And so, in many cases, that type of mitigation, it's more of a mitigation than it is a specific defense. We're not talking about not guilty by reason of insanity. What we're talking about here is a defense attorney using this as a mitigation strategy at trial, to try to get the death penalty off the table, right? Because if that's on the table, perhaps a mitigation where, if someone does have a severe mental illness or some dissociation that happens, they might be able to, that might be successful. My experience has been it rarely is successful. Just like with NGRI, it's not successful very often. So, this is controversy around it, right?
No, it's so controversial. And I believe that the survivors in terms of the ritualistic abuse survivors, they have experienced allegedly such horrific abuse that blocking it out, dissociating, really was the only way they could make it through their everyday lives. But I believe them. I believe them. And so I guess this is tough, but can it hold up in court?
Yeah, that's important to as an important point to make, which is that evidence, when it's introduced in court, it has to pass certain tests, and I don't want to go into all the evidentiary rules around like the admissibility of things, but then oftentimes, we do apply. Generally, most courts apply what's called the Daubert standard when evaluating the admissibility of evidence, and there has to be known base rates and error rates. If evidence is going to be admitted. And again, in this area, because the research is not settled in this area, it's still very, it's sort of open in terms of like, do we really understand what's going on mechanistically in the brain, and can this actually happen? And those are the barriers I think that that lawyers often encounter when they're trying to introduce this kind of evidence at trial. So I will say that I have worked with patients that have clearly experienced what you're describing, this repression of these traumatic memories. And this is, at its core, it is a defense mechanism, right? So that the organism, in this case, the individual, can actually survive. And so you do, in very extreme cases, we can actually see dissociative identity disorder develop, which used to be called multiple personality disorder. And that's also, even though it is a recognized disorder, it is in the DSM-5 TR, which is our, the clinician's Bible, so to speak, of evaluating, whether or not a mental disorder is present. We use criteria to make that decision, that clinical decision. It's in the DSM-5, but there's still controversy around this one too. There's some clinicians and researchers that they're not entirely convinced that DID is a thing. Right. So, but I've seen it. I've seen it in patients who have experienced severe sexual trauma as children, and so it is something that, at least clinically, that I've worked with and I've seen.
This is very helpful. So, in very serious and traumatic abuse cases in children, you have personally seen the dissociative. I can never pronounce that, dissociative disorder in children, because that is how they cope. And that is what I believe is going on here in Utah with the ritualistic abuse. I believe that also, because of what Glenn Pace studied, I do believe that it's possible that the abuser did want control over these children, and this was the only way to do it, truly.
Yeah, and also, children a child's brain, compared to an adult's brain, quite different as well. So this is why, when abuse is happening at very early ages, it can have a more profound impact. I'm not trying to dismiss that, adults experiencing abuse can't be impacted. They can, but the viewers have to understand that a child's brain is developing still, so it's not fully developed. Those circuits in the frontal lobes of the brain, again, which is that part of the brain that that controls our executive functions, those are not fully wired up until most individuals reach the age of around 25, mid 20s ish. So when you have trauma like this happening at a very young age, it has a profound effect on that wiring process as well, we think, and so that can also be another potential explanatory mechanism for why this might be happening in younger children. It might be more profoundly impactful than for an adult.
Yeah. And so in your expert opinion, it is completely possible for someone to block out abuse and trauma and then remember it later in life.
Yeah, that's my opinion, and it's based on my work, my clinical work, but also I'm basing that on what I understand from the current research literature that's available out there. And like I said, it's mixed. So there have been a number of studies that have looked at this. And one of the things I want to point out that I think the viewers need to also recognize is that, again, children are suggestible. So depending on the age, and what I mean by that is that, and we've seen this. We see this a child has experienced trauma, physical trauma, sexual trauma, and they go into therapy, right? And this is where it's discovered. But then, we find out later on that the therapist in this particular setting has led the child and suggested certain things. In other words, there have been prompts in the interaction and the discussions with the child that have potentially been triggered a false memory. And so with suggestibility being more likely in a child, not that adults can't be suggestible, because they can. This is how this explains how some people will fall into and follow cults. They get into a cult because they tend to be very suggestible, and they can be influenced by a psychopath, for example, that can manipulate them. Yeah. So children are more vulnerable to this. So that's the other sort of variable that has to be explored whenever you're looking at when we're dealing with issues of repressed memory that then they surface. And I'm not saying, so again, it's not. I don't think that's happening all the time, but that is something that also has to be looked at too.
I think what's going on here in Utah is that adults it's adults that are recovering these memories, number one. And number two, the other part is that David Lee Hamblin, who has been accused of these crimes, he was a therapist. He has also been accused of planting memories in some of his patients to say that they were abused and whatever. So this is so crazy, Dr. Wetterer, because what I'm learning from you here, unfortunately, is not going to get me anywhere, because it's both things can be true. Multiple things can be true. And that's the hardest part about this. It's,
you have to look at each case individually, right? And I'll make a statement about memory just generally. So this is very clear in the research. I can at least speak to one thing that's clear in the research. And one thing we know about memory is that it's not reliable. Human memory is inherently unreliable. And what I mean by that is, we know that memory is reconstructive, so it is not like watching a video tape of, say, an event that you experienced. It's subject to your emotional state. It's subject to, again, external influences, suggestibility, things of that nature. And depending on the person's personality architecture, some people may be more susceptible to that sort of manipulation that could happen. So
I think you said it perfectly, where it's got to be investigated case by case. It's not a blanket statement here. You've given me a lot to think about, though. I really do appreciate you taking the time to explain all of this. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I will put all of your links in the episode notes where people can find you. Like I said, you make me feel very lazy. No, unintentionally. And yeah, Dr. Wetterer, I really appreciate your time and explanation here and expertise.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to talk to you about it. Yeah.
All right. That was Dr. Craig Wetterer. And I mean, while it was fascinating to listen to everything that he has to say, it's also frustrating in a way, because I don't know if we're ever going to get, again, a conclusive answer, except for the fact that, hey, multiple things can be true, and it's got to be a case-by-case situation. So I appreciated the fact that he did treat patients who have experienced dissociation, and he acknowledges, that no one really agrees on this. And let's say someone's put on the stand at a trial, it could truly go either way depending on the situation. I mean, it sucks. He said a lot of juries wouldn't buy it. But again, I'm going to go back and just remember case by case. And I think what gives me hope is that one day we will get to a trial and someone will be put on the stand and they will have a case that really speaks to a jury, and somebody will be convicted. Finally, one can hope and one can pray. But I think I've thrown enough at you all for today. I hope by the time I have another episode out, we'll have some updates on the David Lee Hamblin case or the Roselle Stevenson case. I'm hoping, fingers crossed. But thanks again, guys, for listening. I hope you like this new format. There's not too much extra babble here, and stay safe and stay vigilant. And I will see you all next time.